Well, over 1,000 players entered the NCAA transfer portal this season, but who did the most to boost their draft stock going into 2024? We're going to discuss our top picks right here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast. Don't go away.
You are Locked On College Basketball, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hey there, welcome into the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, the only daily national college hoop show out there, part, of course, of the Locked On Podcast Network. I am your host, Andy Patton, thrilled to be joined today by our regular contributor, Leaf Tulane, also of the Locked On NBA Big Board, and we're looking ahead to the 2024 NBA Draft yet again here on the Locked On College Basketball Podcast, but we're taking a look at players who hit the transfer portal because there were a whole bunch of them, and we're going to talk about the guys that we think most advanced their chances of getting selected in the NBA draft, primarily for 2024, although some of these guys maybe are looking a little bit longer term in terms of producing for their NBA production. But Leaf, we got 9 guys we're going to talk about today, 3 in each segment, breaking it down, keeping it nice and clean. And I want to start with what was perhaps one of the more notable players to enter the transfer portal this season, a guy who also declared for the NBA draft process and really wanted to stick in that draft process. That's, of course, Grant Nelson from North Dakota State, ultimately pulled out of the draft at the last minute, decided to transfer to Alabama, where he'll join Nate Oates and the Crimson Tide. And I know we talked a little bit about what his fit might look like at Alabama, but I know you got a chance to see him at the Combine, and I'm curious, kind of based on what you've seen from him, what you know about a Nate Oates offense, kind of how this marriage might work and what it might do specifically for Nelson's draft profile heading into next season.
So I think Nelson is an interesting case in this. I think he's put himself in a position that puts him at the top of this list in terms of guys that have now the capacity to move their stock up. But he also has to prove it at a level entirely different. Like when he played at the Combine, he had one good quarter, and he looked good in that. He shot well, but he didn't look like he fully athletically belonged, despite being a very good athlete. He just didn't know how to use it. So now in the SEC, a year older in college basketball, so he's playing relatively younger competition. What does that mean for him truly? So I think with him, he's got the largest jump capacity, but I have less like true faith that his stock rises from this transfer than I do for a few others. But he's given to himself a chance more so than anyone else in terms of what their transfers were.
Yeah, and I think you look at Alabama, and certainly a team that lost a lot of talent, a lot of depth, specifically in the front court. They lose Clowney, they lose Charles Bediako. Brandon Miller was obviously never going to return. And then you get in Nelson. They also I may be breaking this to you, Leaf. It literally just happened. They landed Mo Wagee out of West Virginia as well, another more depth for them in the front court. But it seems like Nelson's going to get a lot of opportunities in this offense to space the floor, shoot from beyond the arc. It feels like an offense that might match his skills pretty well, but you're saying that he's still just got to prove that the jump from the Summit League to the SEC is a jump he's capable of making.
Yeah, and I think it reminds me of Matthew Meyer in a sense. Yeah. Like when he went from Baylor to Illinois, Baylor, his first year where he was relevant was the national championship team, where he was the 4th or 5th option offensively, probably the 6th most important player on the team. And he was a really good spark player. Then the next year, people thought maybe he can be the SEC player of the year. I'm sorry, Big 12 player of the year. And he just wasn't able to fully live up to that because he had more ball in his hand responsibility. And now at the top of a scouting report, you just don't have that same ability to be, like the spark plug. So then he goes to Illinois, and he's given this like role of, hey, you and TJ Shannon are going to be our guys who score the basketball. Coleman Hawkins is going to be the defense, and we'll see what else happens with this like a mess of guards. It feels kind of that way in the sense that he'll want a big role, but at Alabama, they have aspirations to win. So if he's not producing for that big role right away, I have my questions about what role NBA executives will like him to play. What role does he actually play for Alabama that's conducive to winning? And does he help his stock more so than being the man at a Summit League team?
I want to move on to another big, this guy who hit the transfer portal much earlier in the offseason, a few months before Grant Nelson did. That's Kel'el Ware. Ware, obviously a guy who was expected to be at times as high as a lottery pick. in the first round of the draft before the season started. He never really got off the ground at Oregon, ended up getting benched for large chunks of the season, hit the transfer portal, ends up going to Indiana, which I think is a fun fit for him. Coach Mike Woodson going to be alongside Malik Reneau in that front court. They lose Trace Jackson Davis. They lose Race Thompson. It seems like there's a big avenue for him to fill out, but I know you weren't super high on Ware from the get-go, and he didn't do a ton to really prove he's got that first-round talent out of Oregon, but do you think a move to Indiana could help him kind of rekindle some of that next season?
Yes, but I have to see how they play. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I think he plays the 5 defensively, the 4 offensively,
Yep.
and Renew is gonna be the post up, Ware's
Mm-hmm.
to shoot the ball well and protect the rim well. So I think he improved his stock greatly just because that's a better fit than having 3 centers at Oregon.
Mm-hmm.
Had he just been featured as a center and developed maturation-wise, I'm not sure it's like Bloomington's so much better than Eugene for him. I just think
Right.
that there's at least a chance.
Yeah, and Fale Dante coming back for Oregon kind of cemented that Ware just wasn't going to get the opportunity that he needed to get in Eugene, and it certainly feels like it's there for him. Do you think a move to the Big Ten? Like, are you worried about him in terms of defense is a huge calling card for him? Do you think that's something that he's still going to be able to do in the Big Ten, or is that something that we're kind of on a wait and see with him at right now?
I think he is. I'm trying to think of how to put this. I think he's someone that defensively will be able to anchor around the rim.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious to see if he improves strength because
Sure.
the Big Ten in years past, it'll be less so this year, but there's still Zach Edey.
Mm-hmm.
No Dickinson, no
Mm-hmm.
Trace Jackson Davis.
Yeah.
It's been post-centric.
Mm-hmm.
And so he'd be better as like a weak side protecting 5, which or like a drop coverage big than he would be like a banging body up against Steven Crowell, like for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So his stock, I think, improves if he's able to put on a little strength and he helps from the weak side more so than even just like playing post defense.
Mm-hmm. Last guy I want to talk about here before we move on is Arterio Morris. Arterio Morris, of course, goes from Texas to Kansas, was one of the top recruits coming into that class at Texas. But that team, the Longhorns team, just had so much depth in the guard room. They had Marcus Carr, they had Tyrese Hunter, they had Serge Rice, and so he never really got a lot of opportunity. Probably would have seen some more playing time this year, had some legal issues as well, which has kind of dampened the star on him a little bit. And now he goes to Kansas, and it's a little unclear exactly what his role might be with Bill Self's team next season. But do you feel like this is a spot where maybe a change of scenery is enough to get him kind of unlocked? Because we know that the skill set coming out of high school was pretty impressive.
I think the biggest deterrent for Arterio Morris is just the legal issues.
Yeah.
Like, it's hard to overlook
Totally.
what's happened there and then be like, from a draft perspective, as someone who does a lot with the draft, like one of the big things is talent isn't everything in terms of this. Like, you see people slip because they don't do well in interviews. So imagine having this type of thing as baggage.
Yeah.
So from basketball perspective, I think this really does behoove him, this move. It really just depends. What's his usage rate? How much does he get the chance to be what he can be? And is the reason that he doesn't, like, if he doesn't, is it because of legal issues or is it basketball? Because basketball-wise, I think he was as talented as every guard in the Big 12, but maybe Keontae George last year.
Right.
So, like, I mean, it's an interesting situation that's, I think, more to do with the legal situation than basketball.
Well, if we got 3 players who are jumping into the ACC next season that we want to talk about in the second segment, guys who we believe have done some significant work to improve their draft stock. And we're going to talk about all 3 of them after a word from today's sponsor, FanDuel. Baseball season is in full swing, and there is no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. That's because right now, new customers get a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000. That's up to $1,000 back in bonus bets if your first bet does not win. We got the MLB All-Star Game coming up in Seattle here next week. There will be a ton of individual player props you folks can bet on there if you are interested. Either way, you can go ahead and don't miss your chance to snag a no-sweat first bet of up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today. Just go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On College Basketball your first listen or your first watch of the day. We got more fantastic stuff coming your way later this week. We'll continue to keep you updated on the transfer portal goings on. Of course, some new conference realignment stuff happened with the Big 12 adding 4 new schools. We'll continue to keep you updated on all that fun stuff as well. But for now, we're going to continue our conversation here with Leif Tulin of the Locked On NBA Big Board, discussing some players who transferred this past season or this offseason and what it might look like for them next year as they look to get into the 2024 NBA draft. Here we got 3 guys who all transferred into the ACC. We're going to start with the guy that is Arterio Morris is sort of replacing at Kansas in a way. That would be MJ Rice. MJ Rice is a top-tier freshman joining the Jayhawks last year. Didn't really get a ton of playing time with Kansas. Again, Bill Self, like a lot of premier coaches in college basketball, plays a pretty tight 7 or 8 man rotation. It's why you often see a lot of players transfer out of Kansas and out of North Carolina and out of some of those other programs that tend to do that. MJ Rice goes to NC State, a program that's made a lot of fun additions this offseason, and it kind of feels like they've cleared some space for Rice to potentially take on a big role. Of course, they lose Turk Smith to the NBA. John Kell Joyner is out, and feels like Rice is going to have himself a clean opportunity to do some work at NC State. Is that kind of where you're at with him right now?
Yeah, I think despite what people say about the relationships of the coaches and guards there, because they've had plenty of talent, there's been some back and forth. Their guards are allowed to do their thing. It's kind of been the staple of NC State. Even in some down years, they've had some really talented guards. And so I think he's going to have every chance to be a top scorer on that team. And I think he's going to have the chance to improve his stock by being a two-way player, because that's what held Terquavion Smith back. Is he was a phenomenal offensive player at times, sometimes really streaky and inconsistent, but he had such deficiencies. I think he's got more true draft stock and can put up similar numbers, but playing differently and a more conducive to the NBA draft style.
Yeah, it feels like for MJ Rice, I mean, going to a program that has developed guards the way that they have and has had success with transfer guards in the past already. I mean, we're talking about a guy who he played 7.5 minutes per game last year. He was barely, he really wasn't even in Kansas's regular rotation. And for him to be able to be in a position to potentially make a huge jump is really exciting. And I think NC State was kind of one of the more perfect opportunities for him to stay at the high major level and still be somebody who could get the ball and get, 11, 12, 15 shots per game, potentially, depending on how the rest of that roster shakes out.
Yeah, I'd say one thing to add to this is, so they have veteran guards that played without the ball. And so I think those guards will get the ball a little more, like Casey Morsell. But I think the lead scorer in terms of the way they play the game should be MJ Rice. And I don't know if that makes him like a draftable guy right away. Like, I need to see exactly what his game entails as being the top option as opposed to a 7-minute a game guy.
Right.
But I think he's got the tools and the attributes that NBA executives like in those type of players.
Want to move on to another guy, of course, jumping into the ACC, as we said, a guy from Stanford, Harrison Ingram. And Leif, I know you subjected yourself to some Stanford basketball in the last couple of years. It hasn't been the most fun team to watch, but Harrison Ingram, a guy who many thought was going to be a one and done guy, ultimately did not happen. And his development maybe didn't go exactly the way that a lot of people thought, but it feels, again, like he's potentially jumping into what could be a really nice role as kind of a point forward type, a bit of a facilitator for North Carolina, a player that they kind of really need. They had some issues with their guard room last year. Caleb Love entering the transfer portal probably helps North Carolina long-term, just because him and RJ Davis weren't a really good pairing. Now you get RJ Davis, you get Cormac Ryan from Notre Dame, who I think is a better fit. And then you get Ingram, who could potentially be playing a role that I think could be really conducive to a skill set that's valuable in the NBA. Do you kind of see him potentially stepping into a role that might make him more appealing as an NBA prospect?
I think the role's pretty obvious what he's going to do, and I think he should excel in it. The concern I'd have is how many roles are like that in the NBA.
Right.
Like, how many Kyle Andersons are there in the NBA? And how often does a player who plays the point guard like effectively as like a 6'8" guy who's going to be a creator for talented shooters like Cormac Ryan, you got RJ Davis, you got incoming freshmen, you got bigs on the interior and Armando Baycott and Pete and all these guys. The question is, yes, now he's a role player as opposed to what he should have been at Stanford as a star, and what he was perceived as, maybe erroneously. So maybe he'll be a star in his role, which is a good thing to be at North Carolina. But if you're a junior and that's your skill set, what does that mean for you in terms of your role at the NBA level? Because there aren't many roles like that. There are very few Joe Ingles, Kyle Andersons, of these type of people. And also, both those players are far better shooters than Ingram is.
Yeah, I thought that's what I was about to say. The shooting is kind of the big thing here, right? Like he can play this point forward role. He can be a facilitator. He can be a secondary creator. All this stuff that might work really well for him. But if the shooting doesn't show up, I have to imagine that scouts are going to be pretty hesitant to put a first round grade on him, maybe even put a second round grade on him. I mean, he's not young. He's not an underclassman anymore like he was when he was getting first round grades early in his career. And so I wonder if you think that's the biggest thing that he needs to show improvement in as a shooter, or if there's other things that maybe could help him kind of climb into that conversation.
I mean, if he shoots it really well and he rebounds and passes, I think he puts himself in a bit of a conversation. I just think that there's too much tape already on him to really elevate unless his shooting's just like astronomically different.
Right. Which would be pretty surprising to see it change that dramatically after 2 years at Stanford, where it was pretty consistently not all that great. Last guy I want to talk about with you, Leaf, here before we move on to the final segment is Matthew Cleveland. Matthew Cleveland, another big guard type who's going from Florida State to Miami. Of course, Jim Larrañaga has done a very good job bringing in transfer guards and turning them around. This program is going to get Nigel Pack back for next year, but they lose Isaiah Wong. They lose Jordan Miller. And so they have Nigel Pack. They have Wooga Poplar, who's going to step into a bigger role. And now they add Matthew Cleveland, a guy who averaged about 14 points per game last year. Also averaged 7.5 rebounds. He's a 35% three-point shooter in his second season with the Noles. Again, a guy who maybe could have done enough to get drafted out of Florida State, but now he goes to a program that's been to the Elite Eight in back-to-back seasons under a coach who has developed NBA caliber talent in very recent years. Do you kind of feel like a move to Miami is going to help Cleveland get a little bit more exposure and maybe a better role for him and his skill set?
I love Matthew Cleveland. I thought Matthew Cleveland could have been a lottery pick this year. Like I know he didn't play like it, but that's just something I thought he had the talent to be. And I'm trying to picture how I see him making his draft stock better. And it's easy. It's like you shoot a little better, you're more efficient, and you play within an offense that prioritizes guard scoring. Like it's an easy way. I just don't know how high he can go because he is big. He's long. He does this. His shot's kind of funky. So he'd have to shoot better. Defensively, I think he could be really good. So I think he's got an outside chance of being like a junior drafted in the first round if he shoots well. But it's like his game needs the ball because he's not a spot-up shooter, and I don't think he's quite good enough to be drafted as like an on-ball guard at the same time. So unless his defense tremendously improves, I think it's an interesting case where I wouldn't be surprised if he's like, you know what, I'm going to get money here. I might come back and then see what happens just because I think his path forward is less clear unless defensively he becomes an ace.
Yeah, I agree. I think the defense is a question for him, and I would think that possibly could see some improvement there just in a Miami system that might be a little bit better for him. A guy who also shot under 70% from the free throw line last year. Again, the three-point shooting ticked up. His freshman year, he was not a good shooter at all, but he was in a much smaller role. So kind of, I think you need to see some consistency there as a shooter. 6'7" guards are valuable. I think we've seen more and more that teams are in the NBA are really valuing bigger guards as opposed to collecting a lot of undersized twos, which is kind of the position that is the least valuable right now. Cleveland is not that, but I do think that finding a role that works for him and also some consistency as a shooter, like you said, if he doesn't have that, I'm not sure that he can sneak into that conversation, but maybe Miami is the place that'll help unlock some of that for him.
I can see it.
Leaf, we're going to move on to the final segment where we got some WCC players to talk about. One guy coming to Gonzaga, one guy leaving Gonzaga, and then, of course, potentially the next Brandin Podziemski. I know we're going to be saying a phrase, the next Brandin Podziemski, a lot because of his unique path, or the next Jalen Williams, whatever you want to say. We're going to talk about those guys coming up right after this. All right, folks, segment 3 here. Still Andy Patton, still Locked On College Basketball, still joined by the great Leaf Tulane of the Locked On NBA Big Board and a regular guest here on Locked On College Basketball. And we're chatting about guys who hit the transfer portal this year and have put themselves in a new situation where we believe they have the ability to improve their draft stock. I want to talk about, again, a couple of Gonzaga adjacent players. We'll start with the player leaving Gonzaga. 5-star prospect Hunter Sallis spent 2 years in a Gonzaga uniform, never really got consistent playing time. He was a great defensive player, a great point of attack defender, perimeter menace, quite honestly. But they had Rasir Bolton. They brought in Malachi Smith. Nolan Hickman took up a lot of playing time in the backcourt, and we just never really saw Sallis get that consistent playing time. And now he goes to Wake Forest, a place that has taken transfer guards and put them in the NBA. They have done this a handful. I mean, they've done this multiple years in a row at this point. And I think you look at Sallis's skill set and kind of can see somebody who, given 25 minutes per game, 28 minutes per game, could potentially thrive into an NBA caliber player. What are your thoughts on Sallis right now?
My biggest concern about Sallis has always been I don't think he's a true point guard. Mm-hmm. And I also don't think he should be playing entirely off the ball. And he was kind of splitting roles. Mm-hmm. At Wake Forest, they've turned back-to-back non-true traditional point guards into all ACC guys and ACC Player of the Years, basically.
Yeah.
And I think he's got the ability to score the ball better than we saw at Gonzaga because he'll be more featured. I think he's got the ability to pass better than we saw, and he is a tremendous athlete. So what I actually think he should do is play like a point guard that's got a little bit good size, go downhill, show he can be an attack and pass. But I think defensively is where he's going to make his money.
Yeah.
I think if he defends at an all ACC level and scores 15 a game, and he's a junior, right? Yeah. Yeah, so if he's going to be a junior, I think that could get him some consideration for early second round, especially if he scores more than 15 or those assist numbers are as high as his two predecessors transfer point guards were. Because Alondas Williams was like a 2-guard who played alongside Austin Reeves and he wasn't doing that much with the ball. And then Appleby comes in and he was on the ball but also not for much of his Florida career. And then has this transcendent, I'm the pick and roll guard in the ACC. Right. I think Sallis is probably more talented than Appleby. I think Alondas Williams was a hidden gem. I actually really liked him at Oklahoma. But I think he can follow their archetypes and really make a name for himself.
My biggest question with Sallis is similar to yours, but it's also just the 3-point shooting, which just hasn't been consistent for him. Not a super pretty shot necessarily. He was a good free throw shooter, so I know that some people use that to predict perhaps some improvement as a 3-point shooter. I think being in a system where he maybe feels more comfortable shooting, which was definitely an issue at Gonzaga. It felt like everybody on the team, not named Drew Timme, wasn't all that comfortable taking shots, which was, I think, part of their issue. But I wonder if the 3-point shooting doesn't tick up, even if we see improvements in other areas. I think that could be something that holds him back, but perhaps a new situation will give him some more juice in that area. Next guy, Leaf, that I want to talk about, we're still sticking with the Gonzaga guys. This is a player, of course, coming into Gonzaga. That is Ryan Nembhard, one of the more surprising players to enter the transfer portal. Of course, out of Creighton, comes to Gonzaga, follows in his brother's footsteps. It worked pretty darn well for his brother, Andrew, who spent 2 years at Florida, transferred to Gonzaga for 2 years, got drafted in the first pick of the second round, and of course was one vote away from being an all-NBA all-rookie second teamer last year. Ryan hopefully going to follow a similar trajectory. At least that's what he's hoping. I'm curious kind of your thoughts on how much moving improves his draft stock, because this is a guy who, the reason it was so surprising that he entered the portal is he was a guy playing 35 minutes per game for perennially top 15, top 20 team, a team that, made a deep run in the NCAA tournament last year. Of course, he goes to a Gonzaga team that has a bit of a different offense. Do you think it's just maybe a better fit for him in terms of his skill set offensively under Mark Few?
I think it's better because Gonzaga allows you to run and it allows you to play in an offense that has produced back-to-back NBA guards.
Yeah.
And it's been, I think Creighton's got the best sets in basketball, them and Purdue. But NBA isn't much of hey, here's a set play. It's run and gun. If your offense knows how to run an offense, and you know how to facilitate that, and you combine scoring with that and solid defense, then you have a chance. The thing I always thought Andrew was the better player as even while Ryan was on a better team when it was at Florida versus Creighton, because he was a pick and roll savant. I think Ryan was a good pick and roll point guard, but he's not as big, so it makes it harder for him to like find the same passing lanes that Andrew was able to find so consistently. And I would say he helped his stock though, because he's going to play in an NBA style offense as opposed to one that was, tailor made for shooters, and allows him to have the ball so frequently. But I don't think it's an enormous jump. I just think that because he was highly regarded anyway, if there is a slight bump, then he's got just as much to say as any of these guys.
That's really well said. And I think that's kind of where I'm at with it too, of like his numbers might not look different. If you're just staring at his basketball reference page, his first season at Gonzaga, his last season at Creighton, his points per game, assists per game, shooting numbers, they may not change all that much, but just from an eye test, he's going to be showing that he can thrive in an offense that's more similar to NBA style offenses. And I think that's kind of where where Andrew was able to make the jump, was showcasing like, I can get out and run. I can make these, throw ahead passes to get out in transition. I can do some of these stuff that we've seen him do in the NBA, skills that were really translatable for him. And it feels like Nembhard is going to get more opportunities to show some of that, which is what NBA scouts are really going to be looking for when they evaluate him as a potential, I would imagine, backup point guard in the NBA. Feels like a really good area that Nembhard could land. And I think he's going to show some of that skill at Gonzaga this year.
Yeah, I think his best case scenario is like 15, 7, and good shooting splits.
Yeah.
And then you see him in the back end of the second round.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Last guy we want to talk about, again, the next Brandin Podziemski. We'll see how many times we end up saying that. Guys who head out into the WCC, head to Santa Clara specifically, and thrive under Herb Sendek's offense. We saw it with Jalen Williams, who didn't transfer to Santa Clara, of course, but obviously was a hidden gem who exploded at Santa Clara, rocketed up draft boards, and still drafted at 12 and probably should have been drafted higher based on what he did as a rookie for the Thunder. We saw it with Podziemski this last year, transfers from Illinois to Santa Clara after playing virtually no minutes for Illinois. He goes to Santa Clara, averages 19-9, and turns into a top 20 pick in the NBA draft as well. And now we have another player who's projected to potentially do something similar in Adama Ball, heading from Arizona to, of course, Santa Clara. Again, Herb Sendek is trying to find these same guys. Ball spent 2 years at Arizona with Tommy Lloyd. Just never really got any playing time. Played in 49 games, but only 6.5 minutes per game. A guy who was a highly regarded prospect coming out of France. Now he heads to Santa Clara, where, again, 6'6" guard, kind of a similar look as some of the guys we've seen have these kind of breakout seasons. Are you thinking that Ball could be a big part of what Santa Clara does next year?
I think he's different from Podziemski and Williams because he's more of a two guard. Those guys are point guards. I mean, Jalen Williams at the NBA level, I saw him in the summer league 2 days ago, and he was unbelievable, different level from everyone else. But the point being, I thought Adama Ball had a chance to emulate what Benedict Mathurin was at Arizona. So I don't see why in the WCC he can't be a 20-a-game scorer, because he shoots the lights out. He's long, he's wiry, he's athletic. But I think he's more of a 3-and-D than a point guard. I mean, he'll get the ball in his hands enough and playing against competition that I don't want to say is inferior, but it's just not as good as the Pac-12 competition.
Sure, it's not. Yeah.
And so now he's going to get the ball more, because even if he stayed at Arizona, he probably gets some good minutes this year, but he wouldn't be like in the position to have the ball. But I don't think you like people listening to this should think, well, the next Brandin Podziemski, because he's a point guard, it's more he's the next Brandin Podziemski, or could be, because he went from a big school where he doesn't get enough playing time to a school where he should be featured.
Yeah.
And I think it's, you sent me this list, and I had that one in my mind. Like that was one I was excited about. So I think Adama Ball is someone that I would not be surprised at all if people are like thinking he's a bit of a draft darling by like December of next year.
Yeah, it's always fun to see the players that emerge as those draft darlings, the way that Podziemski did, the way that Maxwell Lewis from Pepperdine he burst onto the scene, and then he kind of faded a little bit as the season went on. And they're not always in the WCC, although the WCC does tend to have a handful of these guys every year. And Ball, I mean, it's apparent. It's apparent to see a team that lost Podziemski, that lost Carlos Stewart, who transferred to LSU. They have some room in the guard. They have some spots open in the guard room. Ball comes in, gets the ball in his hands a lot of open looks, going against WCC opponents that aren't going to be as physical as he faced in the Pac-12. I think you're absolutely right. I think you're looking at a guy who could explode and be a all WCC first team guy. And we've seen in the past, NBA scouts are not afraid to draft WCC guys in the first round, and it worked out for Jalen Williams. We'll see how it goes with Podziemski at Golden State, but Ball feels like he could be next in that line. It feels like we're putting a lot of pressure on him here in July, but it feels like that's kind of he's the kind of player that kind of breakout happens to.
I have a prediction for you.
Hit me.
A little bold. I think Adama Ball is going to be top 5 in 3-point percentage in the WCC, top 5 in scoring, and top 5 in free throw percentage.
Ooh, I like it. We'll revisit, because last year you told us that UConn and San Diego State were good before the season started, and that turned out pretty darn well. Yeah. So we'll give you another chance here with the Adama.
I occasionally strike gold.
You had that one last week. I think we talked about Riley Kugel being a top 10 pick. So we'll see if how we can do on this.
And Riley Kugel, for those of you who really want to scour some Twitter, I said, here, who's a guy that no one knows about that could be a one and done? And I put Riley Kugel on there, and I thought Riley Kugel would have been a top 20 pick. So
yeah, would have been interesting to see him stay in that draft process. Leaf, thank you so much for coming on the show today. Really appreciate your time, your expertise. Looking forward to our next conversation, continuing to look not just at the NBA draft, but at college basketball as a whole as we get into kind of the slower months, but still some exciting stuff to get to talk to. So thanks again for coming on.
Of course.
That is going to do it for us today. Thank you all for listening. Of course, you can find the podcast wherever you already get your podcast. Go hit that subscribe button on YouTube as well. Thank you to all of you who are our everyday listeners. Shout out to you. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen to the show on a daily basis. We got more fantastic stuff coming your way later this week. Some more transfer portal news going to hit us, and we're going to talk about that on Friday's show. Thank you all again. And until next time, peace out.